Well, thanks, Rosella. I appreciate it. Thanks everyone for linking in. We're kind of a small group, so feel free to interject when you want. A couple of basics. We've all done a lot of Zoom calls, so you all know the Zoom protocol to just stay on mute when you're not talking, so we don't get background noise. But it is better when people ask questions. So if you want to jump in, what I prefer is if you want to ask a question, don't raise your hand, either electronically or physically, just shout out, okay? Just go off mute for a minute and shout out. So that makes it easier for me to follow things. What I'm going to talk about is this. I'll just introduce it this way. This is kind of a story about a dysfunctional family to prepare for Thanksgiving when we go home to meet our own families. For me, the idea started a long time ago when I was in college in the early 1970s. I took a course on constitutional law, kind of a pre-law course, and I had to read this book, The Nature of the Judicial Process by Benjamin Cardozo. This is a standard book that everyone who goes into law ultimately has to read. It's not very long. It's 160 pages, 180 pages. It's based on a famous speech he gave at Yale Law School in the early 1920s. I was kind of surprised when I pulled it out that it's kind of full of underlinings and notes. So it must have been a pretty good book. I was kind of struck that back in 1971, that's what you paid for a book.
How much?
$1.75.
Oh my God.
So I didn't think much about Benjamin Cardozo for a long time, but fast forward to the late 1980s, I was working as a lawyer in Washington at a federal regulatory agency called the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And I produced my first actual published book, this one here, called The Gold Ring. It's about Jay Gould and Jim Fisk's two robber barons from the late 1860s, 1870s, who were two of the more ambitious, ruthless, aggressive financial manipulators of that era, and they cornered the national gold market. It was considered one of the more outrageous things that was done back then. They bribed a lot of people, a lot of corruption. And sure enough, one of the names that popped up here as a member of their conspiracy was Cardozo, not Benjamin, but his father, Albert. And it turned out the thing that brought them together was Albert Cardozo and Jim Fisk and Jay Gould had a common friend. And their common friend was this fellow. So now that I've done all of my shameless marketing on my books, I will share screen. And this is where all your boxes will become really little, so it's hard for me to see people. And I'm going to tell you a story, a family story about Albert and Benjamin. Share screening has stopped. Bear with me.
And I can give a plug for the Boss Tweed book that Ken wrote while he's looking for it.
Bear with me a moment. It seemed to go away.
Is it in large type?
If you get it on Kindle, it could be in large type. I'm not sure what happened here. Excuse the technical glitch. But I can find this very quick. There we go. Share screen. Share.
Dang.
There we go. There we go. Slideshow from one. So, as I said, I'm going to tell you a family story about a father and a son, Albert and Benjamin Cardozo. So this is Benjamin Cardozo, the famous Supreme Court Justice. You could see here he is in his judicial robes, very handsome man, his very, very open face, looking very prim and proper, very much a straight arrow. One of the things you first notice about Benjamin Cardozo is virtually every single picture of him is exactly the same. Whether he's young in his 20s or whether he's old in his 60s, every picture of him shows him in his judicial robe or else in a three-piece suit with a white shirt, perfectly straight tie, his hair a little tousled like that to make him look a little bit friendly. He always has this image. It's almost impossible, I know I couldn't do it, to find any photograph of him from his entire life that is in the least bit informal. This is someone who is very careful about his public image. This is about as informal a picture as I was able to find of Justice Cardozo. Here he is in his 60s. At least in this one, it's a behind the scenes photograph. The one on my left is him being photographed. You can see the photographer and someone looking in a window. The other one shows him standing, walking, someone laughing in the background. He's holding his hat. His glasses are dangling. That's about as informal a picture as you'll ever find of Justice Cardozo. But he's properly dressed in his nice suit and his straight tie, looking very straight arrow, looking straight ahead. There are also a few pictures like this. Here's Justice Cardozo sitting next to the president. That's Franklin Roosevelt next to him. It's a little unclear whether Franklin Roosevelt is giving Justice Cardozo the chance to sit next to him, or whether it's Justice Cardozo who's giving Franklin Roosevelt the favor of being able to sit next to him. But either way, it's Justice Cardozo looking like the justice, very prim, proper, with his glasses in public. So a few words about this Justice Cardozo. Justice Cardozo was born in 1870, May 24th. He was born with a set of twins, he and his sister Emily. They were the youngest of 6 children. He came from a Jewish family, but it wasn't just any Jewish family. It was a particular Jewish family. His father, Albert Cardozo, the Cardozo side of the family came to America through an uncle, great uncle named Aaron Nunez Cardozo, who came to New York City in 1752. That's 10 years before the American Revolution. They were Marranos from Portugal. So those are the Jews who, during the Spanish Inquisition, pretended to be Christian in order to survive. And then when it was safe, they became Jewish again. His family went up to London and then from London to the United States. On his mother's side, his mother was named Rebecca. She was the daughter of Isaac Mendes Sexius Nathan. And on her side of the family, she dates back to a Rabbi Gershon Sexius, who came to America from Portugal in 1654. That's 100 years before the Cardozos came to America. They came to New York under Peter Stuyvesant. They were one of that very original group of Jewish people who came to America way back at the beginning. So that's his family. On the Sexius side, he had several relatives who fought in the Revolutionary War and who personally knew George Washington. One of them, a Moses Sexius, fought under General Washington's staff. He then helped found a synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. There's a famous letter that George Washington wrote to the synagogue at Newport about Jewish rights in America. And he was writing the letter to Benjamin Cardozo's great-great-great-great-grandfather. He had a great-great-uncle named Rabbi Gershon Sexius, who was a rabbi in New York in 1776 when the British occupied New York. And he gave a speech, a Saturday sermon in a synagogue, talking about the patriotic cause and how America should be free of the British. He earned himself an arrest warrant from the British authorities, had to flee for his life. As a result, when George Washington became president, this Rabbi Gershon Mendes Sexius got an honored invitation to attend George Washington's inauguration in 1788. The Sexius side of the family had leaders from Columbia University, the New York Stock Exchange. The poet Emil Lazarus was a cousin. There were several rabbis. They were all, Benjamin's father, Albert, was the vice president of the Sheriff Israel Synagogue, which was in fact the single oldest synagogue in the United States of America. The family had representatives. One of the relatives was the rabbi, one of them was the president, And Cardozo's father was the vice president and a board member. So as you know about Jewish immigration to America, the main bulk of Jews from Eastern Europe came between 1881 and 1920. Before them, the big German immigration to America happened in the 1840s. The German Jews generally considered themselves more high class than the European Jews, because they came earlier, they were more financially successful. They tended to look down on the more recent European Jews, Eastern European Jews. But even above them were the Portuguese Jews who came at the time of the Revolutionary War. And that's Benjamin Cardozo's family. Around that time, there were about 2,000 Jewish people total in the country. So he was born in 1870. They lived in a very nice house on West 47th Street. His parents died when he was quite young, his mother in 1879, his dad in 1885. He was homeschooled, partly because public schools, they didn't serve you kosher food, and it was an Orthodox family. So he was homeschooled. One of his tutors was a young writer named Horatio Alger, who would become famous over time. He started Columbia University when he was 15 years old. He was Phi Beta Kappa. He left after 2 years without graduating, but he then passed the bar. He went into private practice. He ran for the office of judge of the New York Supreme Court in 1913 and was elected. From there, his rise was very rapid. In the 1920s, he wrote that famous book I showed you, The Nature of the Judicial Process. He also wrote a book called The Restatement of the Law of Torts. Any lawyers on the call will recognize that, something you had to read in law school. In 1917, he was elected to the New York Court of Appeals, then became chief judge of the Court of Appeals. In 1932, Herbert Hoover, President Hoover, excuse me, nominated him to the Supreme Court, to the seat being vacated by Oliver Wendell Holmes. He was confirmed within 10 days. He was nominated February 15th. He was confirmed February 24th on a unanimous voice vote without debate. No dissent for Justice Cardozo. Now, he was the second Jewish judge to join the Supreme Court. The first one, Louis Brandeis, had to live through an agonizing, wrenching 4-month ordeal to get confirmed. He had a difficult several week-long set of hearings that turned very ugly and personal. It wasn't just that Brandeis was Jewish, but he was a known political activist, a consumer activist, and he brought out a lot of opposition. By contrast, Justice Cardozo went through in 10 days with no dissent. Once he joined the court, he joined Brandeis and Harlan Fiske Stone as the liberal wing of the court. He served with distinction through the 1930s. He died at a young age. He died in 1938 after only 6 years on the court. He had a heart attack and a stroke. He never married. Through most of his life, he lived with his elder sister, Nell. When he died, he was considered one of the most accomplished, honorable members of the court of the first half of the 20th century. An important historian of the court named Richard Posner wrote a biography of him called Cardozo, A Study in Reputation. And Justice Cardozo had the best reputation. Here he is allowing President Roosevelt to bask in the glory of sitting next to him in a public stage. So that's the son. Then you have the father. This is Albert Cardozo, the father of Benjamin Cardozo. There aren't too many pictures of him. The one on my left is a newspaper drawing of him, a newspaper cartoon. The one on the right claims to be an old daguerreotype of him. It's from the Loeb Jewish Portrait Database at the Jewish Museum in New York. It's marked as artist unknown and date unknown. Frankly, I'm a little suspicious whether that's really him or not. There are a lot of photographs from that era that are supposed to be people, and you can't quite be sure that's him. But still, it's reasonably close. When you look at him, he's a handsome man. He's a good-looking man. But most of the pictures that exist of of Albert Cardozo look more like this. This is one from the newspapers from the early 1870s. Them making an example of two naughty boys. There you see the New York bench. Okay, so it's judges. One of them is labeled dirty hands. The other is a boy who couldn't keep his hands clean. The one with the mustache is a judge named George Barnard, a notorious judge. And Dirty Hands is Benjamin Cardozo's father, Albert. That's the way he's normally pictured. He was a very striking looking person. His niece, one of his nieces, Annie Nathan Myers, described him as tall and striking, great bushy eyebrows hung low over dark piercing eyes. But there was in his lean, nervous face nothing of the repose or kindliness of his son, Benjamin. This is his own niece talking. This is the father. Now, if you lived in New York City any time in the late 1800s, be it the 1870s, 80s, 90s, even into the 1900s, and you asked anyone, have you ever heard of Judge Cardozo? They'd say, sure. He was a famous man. He was very well known, but not necessarily for good reasons. People who are aware of him today know three things about Judge Cardozo. One is he is the father of the famous Supreme Court Justice who you just saw. Second was he was known for the friends he kept. And he had one particular close friend, this guy. Now, if it takes you a minute to recognize this guy, most people have heard of him, but have never seen this particular picture of him. Like they've probably never seen an actual picture of him. Rather, they've seen him looking more like this.
That's Tweed.
This is a cartoon. If you look at the signature, the artist is named Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was very well known, a brilliant artist at the time, who took on important political causes. And one of his causes was to rail against the corrupt political machine of Tammany Hall in New York City that was led throughout the 1860s and early 1870s by William Muggier Tweed, this gentleman here. This big blob on his chest that you see, that is a 16-karat diamond that some of his friends gave him as a birthday present one year. And you can see his head is all about greed. You may have seen pictures that look like this. This is also Thomas Nast. Who stole the people's money? Do tell, New York Times. And here you see what is known to history as the Tweed Ring. These four guys in the front are the core characters. There's Tweed himself. This is the mayor with the glasses. His name is Aoki Hall, the mayor under Boss Tweed. Richard Connolly, who was the city controller, who had his hands all over the dirty money. And this is Peter Sweeney, the kind of consigliere of the group. The way that Albert Cardozo became friends with Boss Tweed was through this building. This building is, in fact, Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was an actual place. There were a couple of different buildings. The organization goes back almost to the Revolutionary War. It started as a social club, then it morphed into a political club. Then it became very actively involved directly in politics. It included people from Aaron Burr on down. By the 1860s, Tammany Hall, this social club, political club, had become the dominant force over the Democratic Party in New York City. Tammany Hall was able to pick all of the nominees for key offices. Tammany Hall had a thorough organization through all the neighborhoods of New York City where it was able to turn out the vote and get its people elected. It compared itself to Caesar's legions in terms of how effective they were, how disciplined they were in being able to turn out the vote on election day. As a result, they became over time strikingly corrupt. But they had a good side. The reason someone like a rising lawyer like Albert Cardozo would join them was because they opened their doors to people like him. So let's go back and pick up the story with Judge Cardozo. Albert Cardozo was born in 1828. That's the year Andrew Jackson was elected president, so it's way far back. He was born into this well-known Jewish family that dated back to the Revolutionary War. He did go to public schools in New York City. He never went to law school, but instead he read for the law. That's what people did back then. You would become a clerk in a lawyer's office. You would do all the grunt work in the office. You would spend time studying. You would learn as an apprentice. And after you learned enough, you would take the bar exam. And Albert Cardozo passed it in 1849. He married Rebecca Nathan, the daughter of Isaac Mendes Sexius Nathan. So it was the joining of these two very old, established Jewish families in New York City. He became a vice president and trustee of Congregation Shereth Israel, the oldest congregation in the United States of America. He formed a law firm, was quite successful. He did well enough to buy that nice house on 47th Street, a nice quiet neighborhood. He was also able to buy himself a summer house in Long Branch, New Jersey, which was where wealthy people in New York at that time would go and buy vacation houses because it was the closest place to Lower Manhattan. The reason someone like Albert Cardozo would join Tammany Hall, a rising young lawyer, was not necessarily because there was anything corrupt about them, but it was a place to meet people, a place to meet other lawyers, a place to make connections with people in government, other people interested in politics. And also Tammany Hall was very progressive in a small p, small d democratic kind of way. Tammany Hall distinguished itself from the other established New York clubs like the Reform Club or the Union League, those kind, in that it threw its doors open to immigrants and minorities. It had thrown in its lot with the Irish, with the Germans, and with Jews. It would welcome someone like Albert Cardozo, while the Union League would snub their nose at him. So he joined, he became active, and by 1863, which was the height of the Civil War, he was a very, very high-profile member in the club. Now, 1863 was also important for this man. 1863 was the year that Tweed became chairman of the Tammany Central Committee. This is when people started calling him boss, and he consolidated his power. It was also the year of the New York City draft riots, and Tweed's role in New York in soothing tensions after the riots and coming up with a deal where the draft could go forward, but the Irish who opposed the draft could get relief from what they considered an unfair law, and made him a very, very popular person in New York. The wealthy people liked him because he could keep the Irish calm. The pro-war people liked him because he managed to produce soldiers for Lincoln's army. And the Irish and the poor and the working class liked him because he was looking out for their interests. 1863, the year Tweed becomes chairman of Tammany Hall, one of the first things he does is he has the opportunity to fill a slot to nominate a judge for the New York bench, the New York Court of Common Pleas. So he turns to his friend, Albert Cardozo. He nominates Cardozo to become a judge. Cardozo is 36 years old, very bright, very brilliant, very well thought of. And sure enough, Albert Cardozo is elected. Cardozo was a very politically astute judge. We'll go back to Cardozo. He knew how to do favors for people from the bench. One of the ways that Tweed and his organization used to cheat in elections, and they didn't mind if you said so, they were very open about it, but one of the things they used to do is in the weeks leading up to election day, they would go around to all the neighborhoods of recent immigrants. They'd even go to the docks and grab immigrants coming off the boats landing from Ireland or Germany or wherever. They would take them down to the courthouse and they would swear them in as citizens so that they'd be able to vote on election day. Yes, there was a waiting period in New York at the time, but that was often ignored in this process. Albert Cardozo set a record in 1866, 800 naturalizations per day in the couple of weeks leading up to Election Day. All of those naturalized so that they could vote the Tammany ticket. Also, he had an important case in front of him. That year, the New York legislature passed a law saying that you could not sell alcohol after midnight on a Saturday night or on a Sunday. It's one of the first blue laws. The case came before Albert Cardozo, and he declared it unconstitutional. The grounds were kind of doubtful, but he felt that he was an elected judge. He should do what the people want him to do. The blue law was extremely unpopular in New York. A lot of people there liked to drink. And so he knocked it down. He declared it unconstitutional. He didn't get a lot of criticism for that. Most of the newspapers actually applauded him for showing the democratic spirit and knocking down this unfair law. So 1867, he's rewarded for his good work. He's nominated to the New York Supreme Court. Now, just to be clear, this gets a little confusing. In New York at the time, there are two levels of court. The top level is the New York Court of Appeals. Those are the ones who hear appeals from the trial courts. The Supreme Court of New York was the trial level court. So if you were a Supreme Court judge, you heard trials. You were the first level of courts. Then appeals went to the Court of Appeals. But in the 1860s, 1870s, the Court of Appeals had very narrow jurisdiction. It was not able to hear a lot of cases. So Supreme Court justices in New York had a lot of power. They were almost like little dictators because it was hard to go above them. There were only 5 of them in New York City. So if you wanted something done, you could go to a judge and get an injunction and you got it done. There was very little that the other side could do. Sometimes in some of the financial fights, each side would go to a different judge and get an injunction contradicting the other judge's injunction, and then they would have to fight it out, sometimes literally with gangs and fists and bricks. But
Sounds
Judge
familiar.
Cardozo, what's that?
I said it sounds familiar.
Okay, yes, it does. Judge Cardozo won by a large majority. He won by a 57,000 vote majority. He got 76% of the vote. Now, there's an odd story about him around this time, that when he was elected to the Supreme Court, he was surprised to find out that they actually held chambers on Saturday. And this was very embarrassing for him because he's a vice president of Sheriff Israel Congregation, the oldest congregation in the United States of America, where one of his relatives was the rabbi, another relative was the president, he was the vice president and a trustee. And here he was having to go to work on Saturday. So what he did was he went to a Beit Din, a Jewish court, to try to get a ruling on whether he could do this. And in fact, the Beit Din gave him a ruling that public business took precedence over Jewish law, and therefore he could hold chambers on Saturday. I have to say, I've not been able to prove this. I don't know that there is a way to prove this. But when I first heard that, I cannot imagine any Orthodox rabbi giving a ruling like that. But he managed to get that ruling. And this is New York under Tammany Hall, where a lot of things are done in return for favors. And I wouldn't want to directly suggest that a Beit Din would allow itself to be compromised, but still, you can't help but wonder.
But isn't there, sorry,
Go
but
ahead.
I thought there was even something when Joe Lieberman was vice president that he had sort of that kind of a dispensation if it was like a national,
Yeah, a national emergency.
but not just regular work.
No, but he used to walk to the Capitol to attend sessions on Saturday, and he could do anything that required talking, but nothing else. That was the ruling I remember for Lieberman.
But anyways, he got that ruling, and it was kind of precedent setting at the time. As again, I don't want to suggest something that I can't back up, but I guess I just suggested it. So there you go. As a Supreme Court justice, he served loyally. in the Tweed regime. He stayed very good friends with Tweed. So life went on, and then something surprising happened. In 1871, in July, Tweed was toppled. Boss Tweed had seemed untouchable, the supreme power in New York. His ring seemed all-powerful. Those who attacked him were routinely knocked down. But then in July of 1871, the New York Times, which along with Thomas Nast had been campaigning against Tweed for many years, managed to get its hands on a stolen set of account books with the accounts of New York City, the actual real accounts of New York City as it was being handled by the Tweed ring, which showed all of the payouts, all of the embezzlement going to Tweed and his friends. And they took it and they published it on their front page. The secret accounts, proofs of undoubted frauds brought to light. This was an earthquake at the time. It was called the scoop of the century because it revealed all of the actual evidence of what the Tweed ring had done, huge amounts of fraud. Within a short period of time, within a couple of months, Tweed's power over the city was overthrown. He was arrested that October. He was brought to justice. He was tried and convicted on 204 counts of misdemeanor fraud. He was sentenced to 12 years in Blackwell's Island prison. The amount of graft that he and his circle are estimated to have stolen, based on all the investigations that followed, range from at least $45 million. These are 1870 dollars. They range into the hundreds of millions of 1870 dollars, which in modern money would be billions. He is widely considered to be the most corrupt politician who ever served in America up to that time or since, just based on the sheer amount of money he stole and the sheer number of elections that he stole. As a result of this, he went to jail. Yes, it's true, he
Did we lose sound?
Yeah, we lost sound, Ken, but you're not on mute, so I don't know what
I'm
happened.
not on, can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah.
now I can hear you.
Okay. He went to jail. Is that where we left off?
Yeah,
Okay. He went to jail, 12 years on Blackwell's Island. He did escape. In 1875, he managed to slip away and escape. He got as far as Spain, where he was recaptured and brought back. And he ended up dying in the Ludlow Street jail. He died behind bars. So as a result, after Tweed was toppled, all of the people who had been living under his rule and chafing under his rule, once he was gone, they became very courageous and started airing their grievances against all of the collaborators. And one of the collaborators was Judge Cardozo. So I mentioned before, there are three things that people know about Judge Cardozo. One is he's the father of the famous Supreme Court Justice. Second, he was good friends of this man, Tweed. And third was this: charges against Justice Albert Cardozo before the committee, the Judiciary Committee of the Assembly. This is the impeachment committee. Judge Cardozo was raised on impeachment. The state legislature, once Tweed was toppled, took hearings on three particular judges who were close to Tweed. One was George Barnard, I mentioned him a couple of times, and second was named John McCune, and then Judge Cardozo. They held hearings. This is a copy of maybe a third of the hearings. They run about 900 pages long. They heard from dozens of witnesses about all the things that Judge Cardozo did while he was in office. And they prepared this very long 900-page report that the Judiciary Committee was prepared to submit to the state legislature to put Judge Cardozo on trial for corruption for his time under Tweed. So what did he actually do? What did they actually accuse him of? There were a couple of things. I mentioned the naturalizations, this swearing in hundreds and thousands of Irish immigrants or new immigrants right before election day. That was one. There were a lot of charges of nepotism and favoritism and cronyism. He, as a judge, he got to assign refereeships and trusteeships. The large majority went to his nephew, Bratz Nathan. Another big chunk went to Boss Tweed's son. Another big chunk went to another relative of Tweed. He also had a relationship with one particular lawyer who he worked with during this period to issue 135 habeas corpus writs, letting people out of jail. People who paid large sums to this particular lawyer, with the suggestion being that there were kickbacks to Cardozo, that Cardozo was in cahoots with him. So there was a lot of those kinds of dogs and cats charges. But the big scandal, the signature scandal of Albert Cardozo, involved these two people. I don't know if these are familiar to any of you, so I'm going to try to do this really quickly. It gets a little complicated, this part of the story, but bear with me. If I'm going too fast on this part, someone please stop me or ask a question. So the one with the beard is named Jay Gould. The one with the fancy mustache with those cool points on the end of his mustache is named James Fisk. Fisk and Gould. Fisk and Gould are well known from this era. Jay Gould was widely considered one of the most egregious robber barons of the entire post-Civil War period. He built one of the great American fortunes, but he was particularly aggressive, rapacious in his market operations. James Fisk was in many ways even more so, but Fisk died at a young age. He was shot in the back in 1871, so he didn't live a long life. But the two of them, in these couple of years right after the Civil War, went through a hot period. They were the two hotshots in 1868 and 1869, 1870 on Wall Street in New York. The two of them together had engineered a takeover in 1868 of the Erie Railway Company in one of the major corporate fights of this period, the Erie Railroad War. It was a fight for control pitting them against Cornelius Vanderbilt, the richest man in America at the time and one of the most powerful people in New York. Gould and Fisk managed to steal the railroad from Vanderbilt. The contest involved literally the bribery of more than half of the New York State legislature. It involved mass amounts of watered stock being issued by one side and then the other side. But in the end, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk ended up in control of this large corporation, which gave them access to millions of dollars. And they got Vanderbilt, after paying him some money, this is what they did back then, to back off. Once they took control of the Erie Railroad, one of the first things Fisk and Gould did was they went to Boss Tweed and made him a member of the board of directors. So Gould and Fisk and Tweed were like that. They were very close friends. They were very close business allies and political allies. So in 1869, Jay Gould got a very clever idea. Here he is explaining it to Jim Fisk. You can see the caption, plotting the great gold ring of 1869. What Gould decided to do was to try to corner the national gold supply. Very ambitious idea, very difficult idea, very complicated idea. Jim Fisk at first thought it was a little crazy, but ultimately he went along with it. The basic idea was this. And again, bear with me, this gets a little bit complicated, but I'll try my best. In 1869, there were two forms of money circulating in America. There were greenback dollars and there were gold coins. Gold was the currency of the world. Greenback dollars were the currency of America. They were issued during the Civil War. The two forms of money existed side by side. They traded back and forth in a New York institution called the New York Gold Exchange, where traders could trade the two of them back and forth. Now, to corner the gold market was a very difficult idea because there was a lot of gold in America. But what Jay Gould figured out was that most of the gold was really hard to get. It was locked up. Most of the gold in America was out in California. That's where the gold rush was. And back in the day of stagecoaches, before there was a transcontinental railroad, to move gold from California to New York would take weeks at best and was high risk. There was also a lot of gold in New York City, but the bulk of it, about $80 million of it, sat in the New York sub-treasury. Now, later on, it would be moved to Fort Knox, but back in 1869, it was sitting on Wall Street in the sub-treasury building across the street from the stock exchange. So it was there, but it was locked up by politicians who controlled the treasury. So barring those two things, the amount of gold actually circulating in the city was only around $15 million. And that was not that hard to lock up if you had enough money. But it would only work if you could control the sub-treasury, make clear that the politicians would never release the gold. And to do that, you had to lock up the politicians. So this was Gould's plan. He started bribing a lot of people in the Grant administration. His payroll included the #2 official in the Treasury Department, a man named Daniel Butterfield. He recruited into his ring the president's sister and her husband, a man named I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, but the president's sister and her husband, Abel Corbin, excuse me. He made a point to be seen publicly with President Grant himself, so that the appearance and reality were created that the president was part of the ring. And this way he could convince Wall Street and also create some reality over the fact that the government would not release the gold in the sub-treasury to break the corner. And with that, Gould and Fisk started buying gold. They started buying gold on the floor of the New York Gold Exchange. And here you see a picture of the floor of the New York Gold Exchange. It worked basically like a commodity exchange today, like you have in Chicago. Over the course of a couple of weeks, through their aggressive buying, they managed to push up the price of gold from 130, that's 130 paper dollars to each gold dollar. 130 paper dollars to each gold dollar. Within a couple of weeks, they pushed it up to 160. So in other words, they had doubled the value of gold through their aggressive buying in about 2 weeks. Now, the hardest thing about cornering any market, whether you're the Hunt brothers cornering silver or anyone else, is it's one thing to raise the price of a commodity. It's another thing to get out of the corner. How do you sell at the high price without causing the price to collapse? And in this case, what they did was Jim Fisk kept buying gold to push the price up, while Jay Gould started to secretly sell gold to cash in. And they did this as the price kept rising and rising and rising. It worked out fine until right around high noon, literally 12 in the afternoon, 12 o'clock noon, on September 24th, 1869, when two things happened at the same time. First, in Washington, D.C., President Grant finally realized he was being played as a sucker, and he sent a telegram to New York to the sub-treasury saying, release gold now to break the corner. At the same time, a group of bankers who had put together money to break the corner started selling aggressively. In a period of about 12 minutes, the price fell from 162 to 160. And literally in 12 minutes, the price of gold fell in half. This caused major pandemonium, major losses, major chaos. It threw major financial houses into doubt. No one knew where they stand because trading was so chaotic. It literally caused riots on the streets. Here you see Smith, Gould, Martin and Company. That's Jay Gould's brokerage house. He and Fisk were in the back room while this was going on. They literally barely got out alive. A crowd went and started calling for them to come out so they could hang them because of what they had just done to the market. This became known as Black Friday, 1869. So what does all this have to do with Justice Cardozo? Well, all this commotion on the gold exchange was only the tip of the iceberg. Now this, again, is going to get a little bit into the weeds, so bear with me. But it's one thing for the price of gold to go up or down or zig or zag. But the real change of money, the real control of money has to do with how all of those trades are cleared. And standing behind the gold exchange was something called the Gold Exchange Bank. The Gold Exchange Bank was the clearinghouse responsible for all the back office work for all the trades on the gold exchange. So at the end of the day of trading, every one of these floor brokers would make a list of all their transactions, how much they sold at what price and to whom. They would hand it into the Gold Exchange Bank. The Gold Exchange Bank would sit down with all these receipts. They would match up the buyers and the sellers. They would figure out who was a net winner, who was a net loser. They would collect the money from the losers and pay out the money to the winners. That's what a clearinghouse does. Now, on most days, this worked fine. The Gold Exchange had a bunch of clerks working all night long to do it. There were no computers back then, so it was all by hand. But still, they were experienced. They knew how to do it. But on Black Friday, there was such an enormous volume of trading, and the trading was so chaotic that a lot of the tickets turned in were illegible. A lot of them were missing. Some of the brokers reneged on their trades. Some of the trading houses went bankrupt during the day. There was such a volume that the clearance was all backed up. Days went by and the gold bank wasn't able to pay out anything. It was sitting on tens of millions of dollars that it couldn't pay out. This meant the entire city financial district was frozen, and some of the biggest losers potentially were Gould and Fisk. So what do? This is where you turn, if you're able to do it, to a friendly judge and you ask for a favor. And you can't go to any judge because this is a pretty big favor that you need to ask. So what Jay Gould did was he had his lawyers visit Judge Cardozo. And they asked Judge Cardozo to issue a couple of orders on their behalf. And Judge Cardozo looked at the paperwork handed him by the lawyers. The lawyers were David Dudley Field and Thomas Sherman. Any of you have heard of the law firm Sherman and Sterling in New York City? And Thomas Sherman was their founding member, one of their founding members. And what Judge Cardozo did was this. He issued an order saying that the Gold Exchange Bank was insolvent, and he turned over control of the bank to a receiver. The receiver he named was a man named Augustus Brown, who was a law partner of Mayor A. Oakey Hall of the Tweed Ring. So he basically took the Gold Ring Bank, sitting on all the money and all the transactions for the whole week leading up to Black Friday, and he turned it over to the Tweed Ring. He then issued a couple of orders saying what to do with all the money. He allowed Jim Fisk to repudiate all of his purchases of gold that week. Jim Fisk literally walked away from his purchases. He said, I'm buying through these brokers, but the brokers are on their own. I'm not taking responsibility. He issued an order allowing Jay Gould to be paid for his sales of gold. He issued an order saying that the lawyers and the receivers should be paid fees totaling $700,000, again, $1870, that's multiple millions today. And everyone else could eat the loss. No one else would get paid. They were all to sort it out on their own. That's what Judge Cardozo did. It didn't go down very well. Yes, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk got to walk away. Boss Tweed was protected, but the level of public anger about this was pretty high, because the gold corner didn't just affect the people on the gold exchange floor. It affected people all over the country. The losses on the stock market, on the commodity markets, were in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Trade was frozen all over the country, and the impeachment committee for Judge Cardozo laid all of this in his lap. Judge Cardozo was the one who let them get away with it. So, what happened? The committee presented their report to the state legislature, and on the day before the trial was supposed to begin, Judge Cardozo sent a letter to the state legislature saying, "I resign. I'm resigning my judgeship." He said, "I'm innocent. This is a partisan decision, but it makes it impossible for me to command public respect, public confidence, freedom from suspicion as a judge." And so he stepped down at that moment. The family story is that it was his wife who insisted on it because she was in bad health and she felt she couldn't live through a trial. The family story was that Judge Cardozo was vindicated because when he died a few years later, he didn't have all that much money. He had about $100,000, which was still a lot of money at that time, but not a huge amount. There was never any direct evidence that Judge Cardozo took bribe money, but most people assumed that he did. There was never any direct evidence that he took direct orders from the Tweed ring, although he didn't really have to. He knew what was going on. The other two judges were convicted and removed. After this trial, life turned much more difficult for Judge Cardozo. He was forced to move out of his house on 47th Street into a much smaller house further uptown in a much more fringe neighborhood of the city. He kept the house in Long Branch, New Jersey, though. He resumed private law practice, but it was hard to get clients because he now lived under the shadow of this scandal. The synagogue stuck with him. He remained a trustee of the synagogue. His friends at Tammany Hall stuck with him. They kept him on as a member and a member of their central committee. His wife died a few years later in 1879. His daughter, Nell, then 22, had to raise the young children. And in 1885, Albert Cardozo passed away. He died of kidney disease at the age of 56. So it's kind of a sad end to this part of the story. But here's where it gets a little bit more interesting as well. So where did all of this leave young Benjamin Cardozo, the future Supreme Court justice? Benjamin, here you see him again in his Supreme Court robes, looking like Cardozo always looks, very upright, clean cut, well kept. He was 3 years old at the time of his father's impeachment. He was 9 years old when his mother died. He had his bar mitzvah in the synagogue in 1883. At 15 years old, he started Columbia, as I mentioned. He was about 2 months into his first year at Columbia when his father died. And this was a very important moment in his life, because at this point, Albert Cardozo was a very famous man in New York City and not in a very good way. He was still well known as the corrupt judge of the Tweed ring. And so when he died, all of the newspapers carried stories about his life. They carried obituaries, and the obituaries were a recount of the impeachment trial and all the charges about how he bailed out Jay Gould and Jim Fisk and did favors for Boss Tweed, and all the stories of corruption. Benjamin, 15 years old, 15 is a very impressionable age. Suddenly, this changed his life at Columbia University. All of his friends suddenly understood who he was. All of his professors understood who he was. They started looking at him in a different way. He recognized that they were looking at him differently. People started asking him questions. What did you know about any of this? And what do you know about the corruption? And it was a very difficult time for Benjamin. He didn't talk about it very much, but he did talk about it now and then. One of his classmates at Columbia, who would grow up to be also a very prominent judge, we remember right around that time being with Benjamin, having to deal with classmates asking him questions. And he remembered saying this. This is the closest there is to an actual quote of something he said at the time. I was born in 1870. I didn't know anything about what was happening to my father, but he was a fine dad, unquote. That's what he's quoted as saying. He talked about it a couple of more times, not very frequently. Around this time, he started concentrating very much on his studies. He seemed to have a mission that grew out of this period. At the end of Columbia College, he decided to go to law school, and this surprised some of his friends and professors, as most of his interests were in the liberal arts. He felt obliged to talk to one of his professors, a man named Seligman, who remembered that Cardozo said he was going to go into law, quote, to clear up the disgrace to the family name. Now, this is Seligman describing what Cardozo told him, to clear up the disgrace in the family name. A couple of years later, Judge Elkin, who was one of his contemporaries on the bench, and they were talking about a case, Cardozo said that he had a desire to work away his father's disgrace. One of his biographers noticed how around this time, Cardozo started to show an immense and impregnable, perhaps even excessive propriety, trying to be nose to the grindstone, to be a clean citizen, to overcome the shame on the family. In 1813 came a turning point for Cardozo. By this time, he was older. He was a prominent lawyer in private practice. In New York City, Tammany Hall was still in charge. They were still the most powerful political body, although even they had changed. They had become more or less corrupt than they had been before. But at that time, there was a reform movement that wanted to challenge Tammany because of the chronic corruption in the city. They formed a citizens municipal committee, and they decided to run a fusion ticket against Tammany in order to get Tammany out of City Hall and stop the corruption, limit the corruption. They put together a slate that was headed by a man named John Perroy Mitchell, a 34-year-old young lawyer, very clean cut. He'd later become a World War I Army pilot. He shot down and killed during the war. And in putting together their slate, there were two openings on the state Supreme Court. Now, this is the same Supreme Court that Cardozo's father sat on. They decided that they wanted a Jew for one of the seats. Now, this was ethnic politics when ethnic politics was played openly by professionals. They wanted a Jew to split the ticket to get the Jewish vote. They were very open about it, very, very explicit. They had some discussion about what Jew to pick. There were a couple that they considered, but they wanted someone who could stand up as a real Jew, not just an apostate. And Judge Cardozo, Benjamin Cardozo, private lawyer, even though he wasn't very religious at this point, still he was active in the Shearith Israel Synagogue, the oldest synagogue in the United States of America. So on that credential, they put him on the ticket. He was endorsed by the New York Times, by some of the Yiddish newspapers. John Perroy Mitchell gave him a very nice compliment, pointed to his sterling character, his independence from unworthy influences. Mitchell won the mayor office by a landslide. 120,000 votes was his margin. Cardozo just squeaked by. His judicial district included part of Manhattan, part of the Bronx. He lost in Manhattan. He carried the area in the Bronx. He said afterwards that he thought he would have lost except for a group of Italian Americans who voted for me because my name ended in O and they thought I was one of them. And whether that's true or not, whether people thought he was Italian, so they voted for him, who knows? But he managed to squeak by and become in charge. It was quite a vindication for him. Here was Benjamin being elected to the exact same state Supreme Court seat that his father had been forced to resign 41 years earlier. And he did it not on the tails of Tammany Hall, but over the objection of Tammany Hall, on the ticket fighting Tammany. So it was a big moment for him. The rest after that is history, as I mentioned. He became very distinguished on the bench. He moved up to the State Court of Appeals. He became the chief judge of the Court of Appeals. In 1932, he was nominated to the Supreme Court. He was confirmed unanimously on a voice vote within 10 days. So all of this leaves us, what's going on? Here we are. All of this leaves us with this image. We have the younger Cardozo, the Supreme Court justice with the most sterling reputation in the country. And then you have the crooked judge as the father. And I was always troubled by this image, this contrast that people drew. Around the time that Cardozo was appointed to the Supreme Court, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was a very prominent Jewish rabbi at the time, he was the founder of the Reform movement, but he was very prominent in politics as well. He said this: "The glory of it will be that although the father came under the malign influence of Tweed and made the name Cardozo synonymous with shame, in 20 years, Cardozo, the younger, Benjamin, has effaced the memory of the father, and his name can never be used save in terms of reverence and honor. What an achievement for a man." I have always thought this was a little bit unfair for the following reason. It's very easy to judge as outsiders what you think of people, who is corrupt and who is not corrupt, whether you think they're a good person or a bad person. Remember what Cardozo himself said, Benjamin, the closest we have to a quote. "I was born in 1870 and I didn't know anything about what was happening to my father, but he was a fine dad." In looking at this, I was reminded of something that our own Rob Natan gave us a couple of weeks ago, a little talk he gave, talking about Noah. Noah from the Parsha and the Torah from a few weeks ago, Noah who would build the ark to save all the animals while God was flooding the world to drown the entire generation of people alive at that point, except for Noah and his family. And the opening line of that Parsha was, "Noah was a righteous man in his generation." And Rob Natan pointed out how this is kind of faint praise. What does that really mean? He was a righteous man, but compared to everyone else in his generation, everyone else was so rotten that God was about to kill them all in a big flood. So what does it mean for Noah to be a righteous man? Yes, he's better than everyone else, but still. So Albert Cardozo's generation, who was he? This whole period, the Civil War and the 10 years afterwards, has a name among historians. It's called the era of good stealings. The era of good stealings. This is considered the most corrupt period ever in American history. During the Civil War itself, when Albert Cardozo was a lawyer rising through the ranks, he saw the most respectable people in New York City, members of the Union League Club, the best businessmen, making enormous fortunes selling defective goods to Abraham Lincoln's army. The word shoddy comes from Brooks Brothers, which sold uniforms to the army that were made of a material that would rot when it rained. It would fall apart when it rained. Rotten food was sold to soldiers in the Civil War by major companies. Arms makers in New York were selling defective weapons. And the owners of these companies making all this money were some of the most respectable citizens of New York. Afterwards, the gold corner that Cardozo played a role in, well, the people involved in it included the household of the President of the United States. They included some of the highest officials in the government. Around this time, his was the era of the grant scandals. In Washington, D.C., you had the whiskey ring. You had the credit mobilier scandal involving bribes on Capitol Hill, involving the Transcontinental Railroad. That one alone involved bribes to dozens of congressmen, including the Speaker of the House and the future Vice President, Schuyler Colfax. In New York City, everyone had a finger in the Tweed ring, including Republicans, including businessmen, including the press, the rich and the poor alike. When the New York Times and Nast started campaigning against Tweed, they were isolated people. Now, all of this is not an excuse for being a corrupt judge. Corruption is bad, stealing is wrong. But remember, there were three things that Cardozo did. He was friends with Tweed, and he was impeached for all of that corruption. All of those are the bad things. But if you're going to ding him, if you're going to blame him for the bad things, you also have to remember the good thing, that other thing he did. He was the father of Benjamin Nathan. He raised Benjamin Nathan for the first 15 years of his life under difficult conditions, and he raised his son to be an extraordinary human being. He raised his son to be a very good lawyer and ultimately one of the most prominent jurists of the 20th century. So if you're going to ding him for the bad things, you also have to give him credit for the good things. And with that, I'll leave you with this image. I'm happy to take any questions. And thank you all for being patient as I talked on for over an hour. I'll leave it there. Any thoughts or questions or comments or something to give me an excuse to stop talking for 5 minutes?
Can you remind us how old Benjamin was when his father passed away?
He was 15 years old.
Oh, okay. That's when the newspaper articles came
That's
out.
when the newspaper article
For the obituary. Got it.
Yes. He was just starting college at that point.
Do you recommend the book about the judicial process for non-lawyers?
Yeah, it's actually a pretty good read. Where did I put it? Right here. Called The Nature of the Judicial Process. It's written for non-lawyers. It's written in a very simple way. The reason that a lot of college, undergraduate courses make you read it is because it is written for non-lawyers. It's designed to give you a taste of how judges are supposed to think. Back in the days when judges were nonpartisan and tried to be neutral players.
That was great, Ken. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
Is there any information about why he never married? Does it have something to do with his childhood, where it happened? He was
Good
just
question.
too busy trying to live a good life and didn't want to be distracted.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because I've written a lot about this era, and it's something that you run into a lot. And it's not uncommon for people to have never married. Samuel Tilden is another one. Samuel Tilden won the popular vote for president of the United States. He too never married, and he had a close lifelong friendship with another man, a reformer in New York. But very few people have just run to the conclusion that he and the other guy had something. It just was not, whether there were platonic reasons or not, we simply don't know. And I'm not aware of any of his biographers who jumped in to try to guess one way or the other.
Ken, the story of Cardozo and his father, it parallels for me, another much more recent Jewish scandal, Bernard Madoff and his sons. And, with Madoff, it was very different because the sons were adults when he was committing his crimes. And not only that, they were involved in his business and may have engaged in, a sort of willful blindness. And as a result, could never be forgiven. And of course, they both, they came, both of his sons came to untimely ends pretty soon after, their father went to prison. But with Benjamin Cardozo, I mean, obviously he wasn't even born during the Panic of '69, and he was couldn't remember anything about his father's disgrace. So it's somewhat credible that New York society or the politicians could forgive his family disgrace, and he would become a judge, during a time sort of almost within the living memory of his father's legislative hearings. But the other thing is, I don't think, if that had happened today, I don't think you could ever erase the kind of scandal that Albert Cardozo got himself into, where he was almost assuredly guilty of committing crimes that were, for a sitting judge is absolutely reprehensible. That no matter how upstanding a life Benjamin the son would live in today's society, there would be no way that he could erase the disgrace of his father to the extent of his family name and what his father had done, to the extent that he could be, become a Supreme Court justice. It would just be completely impossible. So,
I think that's right.
Carl, thinking back to what you said about the solemnity of most photos and images of the Supreme Court judge, I'm not really surprised. 15 years old is a heck of an impressionable age, and you just carry everything with you. And it might have been his attempt to put down that scandalous image of his father and overcome it with his own good conduct medals, shall I say. But I guess I feel really bad for a person like that. When he was 15, both his parents were dead?
Both his parents were dead, yes.
So did he have anyone else for family?
Yes, he had this interesting relationship with his older sister. His older sister, when his mother died, his older sister was, I think, 20 or 22, I think I said.
Oh, so she was quite a bit older than when he was.
Right, he was the youngest. He was the youngest.
You said the twins were born when the twins were 3 when the mother died. Was that right?
The mother died in 1879. He was born in 1870. So the twins were like 9 years old. 9.
Okay, so a little old. So
the sister was maybe 8 or 9 years older than them. And she was the one who stepped in after the mother died to take care of the kids. The fathers didn't take care of kids back then. It was the dads were not like dads today. And so she became not only the one who raised him, but she was the one he lived with, and for the rest of his life. I mean,
did she marry?
No, she didn't marry either. So it was the two of them who shared a house. And that too was not that uncommon a thing, although it was more for widowers. It was more common for a widower to bring an elder daughter in, or a sister in, or a cousin in to.
And his twin?
I'm not sure what happened to the twin. The twin probably married. Her name was Emily. But Cardozo and the older sister were the two that lived together into adulthood.
I mean, other than so here's another question about
Sure.
This started out as a tale about the father, but I can't help but wonder, are there any notable decisions to which his name is attached as Benjamin?
Oh, many. I mean, there's a very long list. I won't try to recite them, but if you go into Google, you'll see a list of like 30 of them.
The most famous decision he's associated with didn't come as a Supreme Court justice. He decided it on the New York Court of Appeals. It's a case called Paul's graph, and it involved this issue of sort of, if one event happens and then there's like an intervening event and someone gets hurt as a result of the intervening event, did the party who caused the first event, are they still liable even though there were intervening events? And it involved I believe someone standing on a train platform, and I think a train, and there was some, I think the train comes in. Ken might know this better than I do, but I'm just going from memory. And there was some time passes, but then something drops on this person's head and they were injured. And the question is, did the party who kind of caused this seismic eruption earlier, are they liable for the person's injury? Is that it, Ken? Do I have that
I
right?
think so. I'm in my mind, I'm thinking Erie Railroad Tompkins, but I remember proximate cause. And
Oh, that's Erie. I thought that was Paul's grab. Okay. Well, Erie Railroad is choice of law, right? Isn't that that's a famous choice of law decision? It might be different.
Well, Paul's graph is correct.
there you go.
And it happens that Cardozo is one of my idols.
Mhm.
And why is that? Well, I'm half Sephardic.
Mhm.
So I was particularly interested in his career. You talk about whether you can overcome the difficulties of your father or whatever. Cardozo was such an extraordinary figure in the law in the 1920s and 30s that it would be beyond the normal considerations. I can't think of any analogy, but just as you said, Ken, he was approved unanimously by the Senate, and he was the successor to Oliver Wendell Holmes.
Right.
And when Holmes died, he was the obvious choice to replace him. He's best known for his so-called common law decisions, his decisions on the Court of Appeals. And when he was chief judge there, they loved him. They adored him. It was just unbelievable. Anything that Judge Cardozo said, they were fawning over him. And when he retired, when he left that bench, they were beside themselves.
Yeah.
When he went to the Supreme Court, he didn't have quite that kind of impact. And of course, he was only on the court for
6 years. Yes.
when he died. And he was still a young man, but it was an extraordinary life. And I would just point out, since my Sephardic background,
Uh-huh.
you mentioned the early part of his history, and the name Seixas comes up, and that's the way it's pronounced, S-E-I-X-A-S.
Seixas.
Seixas.
Okay.
And he was just, that was a royal family as well, in Jewish life at that time. And then when he came to the court, it was a fitting a tribute to his years as a common law judge, and it's too bad he didn't live long.
Yeah, and just along that, when Sonia Sotomayor was appointed to the Supreme Court, a lot was made that she was the first Hispanic woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court. There were some people who said that actually the first Hispanic judge really ought to be considered Judge Cardozo. because his family came from Portugal and happened to be Jewish, but he came from Portugal by way of England, by way of New York. But it didn't go very far, that movement. But the other thing that struck me looking at it was knowing somewhat about New York City politics from that era when things were so partisan and Tammany Hall and the competition was so raucous that when Cardozo ran for the New York Supreme Court, both parties were tripping over themselves to endorse him. I mean, he was the candidate of both sides each time he ran. The first time when it was a close call, that was the only competitive election. Once he was established and people got to know him, he was appointed almost by acclamation, even running in New York City. When Herbert Hoover had to replace Oliver Wendell Holmes, he was a little nervous about picking someone. It was kind of that situation where he just had a few months left in his term. He knew he was going to get defeated soundly by Franklin Roosevelt. Things did not look very good for him. And he wondered if he picked someone, would he get confirmed? And he floated a couple of names, but then he floated the name Cardozo. And when he did, suddenly all of the leading senators from both sides, the William Borahs and the people like that, who would normally be the skeptical ones, all came back and said, Cardozo, fine. So he had that, people knew of him and he had that reputation.
Yes.
I think you're right. If this were to happen today, it would be so much harder to live down a scandal like that. Just because all of the information, all the gory details, all the photos would live forever on Facebook and on the internet, and it would be so much harder to escape.
I would guess that in today's horrendous atmosphere, his name probably would not even be mentioned.
Yeah.
For the benefit of my Sephardic wife who's sitting next to me here, one of the top tennis players in the world in the 1950s was Victor Seixas, the same spelling, so it must have been the same family. The other thing, Ken, is I love that picture you showed of Boss Tweed. I don't know if any of you saw the Martin Scorsese's film, The Gangs of New York. The actor who played Boss Tweed in that film looked exactly like the picture you showed.
Yes.
The third thing, and then I'll shut up, is I also went to Columbia as an undergrad, and one of my favorite courses was called the History of the City of New York, and it was taught by Professor Kenneth Jackson, who I think
I know the man well. He's a good one.
Yeah, and he was just fantastic. One of the great courses I've ever taken, and ironically, he was from the South. But he had lived in New York so long, he was an expert on it. And one guest speaker in that course was another famous Columbia history professor named James Shenton. And James Shenton came to class one day and gave an absolutely spellbinding lecture on the New York City draft riots of 1863. And here's my question, Ken. That it's well known that in the New York City draft riots, African Americans were targeted and many were killed and hung. Did they target Jews also?
No, not really.
Okay.
They targeted African Americans because they were very much set up. African Americans were being brought in as strikebreakers at a time when the Irish felt that they were getting abused by the draft, by their employers. So it was a very ugly situation, but no, Jews were not targeted in it.
I was just wondering, we were in Philadelphia last weekend and we saw Chaim Solomon's grave, famous Jewish financier, the American Revolution. But I didn't know if Jewish financiers played a part in financing the Civil War at all. That's something I never.
Well, I could tell you this. And Steve, I know you had your hand up, so I'll get you right after this. As far as the Revolutionary War, one of the people who helped finance it on the British side was the original Rothschild.
Right.
He was the kind of court financier for the. I trip over the titles because they're very weird back then, but the Prince of Hesse in Germany, who was renting soldiers to the British. Yeah. These were the Hessians. Yeah. And the original Rothschild was, the father Rothschild was his banker, the banker of Hesse.
Well, they financed the Napoleonic Wars
Yes.
too. Yeah.
For as far as the Civil War goes, I think there were Jewish financiers on all sides of it. There are many Jews in the Union who were helping to finance the northern side, but you also had Judah Benjamin, who was the finance minister or finance secretary of the Confederacy.
Right.
He was the one who came up with the whole idea of cotton-denominated bonds that they were selling to finance the southern side of the war. So we were all over the place on that one. There was a big Jewish settlement in Charleston. There was many Jews who were coming in through New York. Almost as many were coming in through Charleston up till the Civil War. Steve, I think you had something. No? Okay. Other thoughts, comments, questions?
Excellent report.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much, Ken. Do you want to share the name of your book again?
Oh, I'll give you that. Well, this is Boss Tweed, for which Ken Jackson actually wrote the review in the Washington Post when then the book came out in 2004, and he gave it a very nice review. I'm happy to say.
High praise.
And then this was the one about the gold corner, specifically about the gold corner. This book came out in 1988. It was my first published book way back in the day.
Mazel tov.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
Thank you, Ken. I loved it.
Okay, my pleasure.
History buff.